Mandy, thank you again. Thank you for taking our time and showing up and being available for this podcast today and allowing us to meet with you and have a conversation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you. Mandy, I'm curious to hear a little bit about your journey before we dive into some of the questions around your book, leadership, and all of that experience that you have. Talk to us a little bit about your experience, your journey. Uh,
Cool. So, yeah, I was growing up in the north of England in sort of, I wouldn't say deprived area at all. It wasn't a deprived area, but it was certainly on the outskirts of Manchester, which in that period of time, in the late 1970s and early 80s, it was certainly not a particularly aspiring area to live in. And basically, I first started hearing lots of stories about my grandpa, and I talk about the need for having role models in life. And I think it's really
mm,
important. And I recognized very early on that my grandpa was a very, very integral part of growing up for myself. And I heard him talking about lots of stories about when he was a pilot in the Air Force. And in those days, though, women weren't flying in the Air Force. And so when I would hear these stories, I'd be very excited by them. But of course, this was not a career that was going to be open to me. But we have an organisation in the UK. It's called the RAF Air Cadets, and it's a free organisation run for 13 to 18-year-olds. And if you join that, you get the opportunity to fly. And so they open their doors to girls. And my mum happened to notice an article and she said, why didn't I join? And I went along and I absolutely loved it because while I was there,
mm,
did get the opportunity to fly.
mm,
And I remember being airborne and I said to the pilot, as a 13, 14-year-old girl, excuse me, sir, do you get paid for this? And he laughed at
mm,
me and he said, well, of course I do. It's my career. It's my job, but it's also my passion. And it was
mm,
this first time I'd really heard anybody linking the magic words of passion and career, because
mm,
I'd been surrounded by people who went to work because they had to earn money.
mm.
And at that moment, I set my sights on flying fast jets in the Royal Air Force.
Wow.
Which was going to be quite an outrageous ambition
Mm,
because it was an impossible dream because
mm,
women were not allowed to be pilots in the Air Force. So
mm,
I'd set my sights very, very high.
mm.
And it was going to be a challenge to get there, I'll be honest.
Very unusual start.
It was an unusual start, but I think the nice thing there is that it could then grow organically because through the Air Cadets, I
Mm,
learned a lot about leadership, a lot about
mm,
teamwork. So all of the things that we would consider extracurricular, the soft
mm,
skills,
mm,
academic that I was learning through school. And
mm,
actually, all of those started to really set sort of something within me as well. And
mm,
so when I was 17, I applied for something called a flying scholarship. And it would give me 30 hours of free flying. And I was awarded the scholarship. And I used some money that I had saved up from a newspaper round money,
mm,
as I'd done when I'd been a young girl. And I paid for the additional 10 hours. And then I held my private pilot's license. Now I could take anyone up flying. Um, and I held my license to fly before I could even drive a car, Haris, which is
mm,
really strange. So
mm,
17
mm,
years old, able to fly an airplane before driving. And then I went off to university, and there was another organisation at university, and the University Air Squadron, and I joined that one and gained 160 hours of flying. But women were
wow.
still allowed to be pilots in the Air Force. So I'm doing all of these things
Mm,
that is setting
mm,
myself up. And I think,
mm,
when you look at life,
mm,
so often, it's not always a direct path to where we're going.
mm,
It's easy to
mm,
think it feels out of reach. But what I'd
mm,
always say is take any small opportunity so
mm.
that you feel like you're constantly moving forward in life. And that's what I was doing really from a very, very young age.
And tell me, being at that age, at that time when it was very unusual and not women were not allowed, what drew you to think about even flying?
So when I first got airborne, I remember thinking, and I would still describe it to this day, it's like dancing in the sky. There is a
Mm,
sense of freedom when you're airborne.
mm,
The aircraft doesn't care what gender you are, it cares whether or not
mm,
you can fly. And
mm,
this freedom that comes with it and being able to really challenge yourself in such an unusual environment where the smallest mistake can lead to a loss of life. And so I quite liked the fact it was challenging. I loved the fact that there was risk involved. I'd always been someone that really loved taking risks.
mm,
And love the fact that when you do it, every single day is different. The weather conditions are different airfields that you're flying with different people. And so it's really varied as a career as well.
mm,
And
mm,
one that really, really interested me. The thought for
mm,
myself, the point of working in an office or doing something that was much more routine and regular just did not appeal to me at all as a young girl.
And I'm also thinking now that when no woman was flying, you being alone there, how was it for you as a young girl in a male dominant environment?
Yeah, it was really, really tough actually.
Uh-huh.
So when they did change the rules to allow women to become fast jet pilots, I applied to join, and then I failed all of the tests to be a pilot twice
Right.
actually. And it was
Mhm.
only the fact that my boss, who was a male boss, was very much a middle manager, but he didn't look
Mhm.
at my test results and say, "Well, Mandy's failed her test and therefore she can't fly." He said, "Mandy is flying and she's really good. So actually, what's wrong with the tests?" And so
Mhm.
he challenged the Air Force on my behalf, and they discovered the majority of women were failing the tests. So there was an
Mhm.
unconscious bias that they found in these tests that they'd been unaware of. And in the end,
Mhm.
they offered me the option to be taken on initially as an air traffic controller, and then they gave me my branch change to become a pilot whilst I was then going through flying training or going through officer training. And, I started on my journey, and it's going to cost around £3.5 million to train a pilot to get to the front
Mhm.
line of fast jet flying. So they don't do this lightly.
Mhm.
And going through that training was tough because you were often the only girl on any course. There was one girl on a course in front of me. There was one girl a couple of courses behind me, but we were right at the vanguard of change, seeing this
Mhm.
huge cultural shift in the military as a whole.
Mhm.
One thing I would say though, Harris, going through that flying training, the people on my course were like my brothers. They were my best friends.
Mhm.
Talk about sort of camaraderie. You'll
Mhm.
never ever experience anything that's quite where you become quite so close to those people that you're working with.
Mhm.
Because you are living, breathing, sleeping at that same space. We're all living in an officer's mess. We all socialize together. We all eat meals together. We go to work together. So you're probably together realistically for what? Everything but the 8 hours that you're sleeping every night.
Mhm.
And so that camaraderie that gets built up, it offset the feeling
Mhm.
of me being there as the only woman, because
Mhm.
ultimately I've got my best friends with me, and we'd
Yeah.
have gone to the earth for each other.
Interesting. And Mandy, experiencing a male dominant, still a brotherly and friendly environment, what are some of the lessons you learned,
Yeah.
through that environment, being a woman?
I think it's a really good question, and it's one that you often get asked because we talk about what would be the advice we would give to our younger selves. And I think, when I look back, I think that I desperately tried to fit in for way too long. I
Mm,
sort of lost like my own identity to some degree, Harris. And I think the really difficult thing there is that I think so many women, when they start to perhaps get promoted in their workplace,
mm,
we then start to actually morph our behaviors thinking that we need to change who we are to
mm,
actually make impact perhaps at board level or perhaps in senior leadership teams. But the reality is that you're actually being employed and you're getting promoted because of who you are, not
mm,
because they want you to be.
mm,
And by bringing that diversity of thought, not
mm,
just through gender or through culture, but I think there's a cognitive diversity there that comes with that.
mm,
You're offering a different viewpoint. And my
mm,
my biggest advice to myself would be true to yourself, be your more authentic self a lot
mm,
earlier on. I learned a very important lesson, and it was while I was away actually. We were on an exercise. I was flying the Tornado GR4 by now, and I was on the front line, and we were on an exercise in America, a big one called Red Flag, and it's an incredible exercise where they bring 12 different nations together. And the philosophy out there is that you're going to train harder than you're ever going to fight for real.
mm,
And so you'll put through paces. And we were all going out for dinner one evening. So there's about 200 men and myself. And flying with a French navigator, a lovely, real gentleman. And I'd sort
mm,
of got dressed up for the occasion and I was wearing, a dress and high heels. And we went out for dinner and I appeared in the hotel foyer. And, everyone sort of looked towards me, but
mm,
Michelle, the French navigator, and myself connected eyes. And he said, "Oh, Mandy, you're looking beautiful this evening." And a guy next to him sort of playfully hit him across the head. And he said, "You can't say that to Mandy. She's one of the
mm,
boys." And it was Michel that turned back with this wonderful French, Gaelic shrug. And he said, "You Brits, you have so much to learn about women." And I thought it was really true because it was only at that point that I did realize that I'd lost sight of who I was, that I'd morphed into being one of the boys because I'd desperately been trying to. But the second that I recognized I needed to be more authentic, it set about a
mm,
ripple throughout the entire organization. Because when I first arrived on the squadron, there was a
mm,
real sense of testosterone, very male dominated, very alpha male. And yet
mm,
when I started to be me, it gave permission in many ways for them to start being more themselves. And it's
Mm,
not only women that are trying to pretend to be someone we're not, but it can be
mm,
everyone. And
mm.
I think when we talk about authenticity, it's really important to recognize that we all pretend to some degree.
Yeah.
But when we're not pretending, that's when we're operating at our very, very highest levels.
And I also like what you said about cognitive diversity. I think women, as a gender, they also have a way of thinking, I think, way of perceiving, and I think bringing that onto the table with authenticity was
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important, I think today, especially where we are seeing much more cognitive diversity coming through in our younger generations,
Mm-hmm.
whether that be through my two children, my husband are both dyslexic, whether that's through someone having ADHD. It's about recognizing the strengths that they are bringing and seeing
Yeah.
that as their power. That is their individuality. And Richard Branson, an amazing entrepreneur, he is a huge ambassador for dyslexia. And he talks
Mm,
about it all the time about how much lost revenue there is by not allowing people to sort of even get through that initial level because they are so
mm,
dyslexic. You're missing
mm,
out on all creative thinking that often goes. And so I
mm.
think it's really important that we don't want to just always recruit from echo chambers,
Right.
because if we do have everyone agreeing and then it's a very pleasant place to work and we get nothing done because we all agree with each other.
Mm,
So it's good challenges, and good to have challenging conversations, especially around
mm,
leadership.
mm. True. You said especially around leadership. Yeah. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about what are you busy doing these days?
So I do a lot of consulting. I speak all around the world, actually. I think I've
Yeah.
been to 15 different countries already this year so far.
Mm,
And I talk all around leadership, trust, decision making under pressure, stress management. Talk a lot about safety, actually, as well, because of course I've come from an industry where safety is literally the number one thing. If you
mm,
get it wrong, you can die.
yeah.
I was speaking in Portugal yesterday, and it
Mm,
was to an engineering company who work in basically creating data centers, so very high voltage electricity. And if they get it wrong, people die. And so we were really taking all of our lessons that we've learnt and labored and perhaps lost lives actually learning those lessons within aviation. And I actually translate them all into a very much a business perspective so that businesses can hear from a different environment, but one that's non-threatening to themselves. Because
mm,
sometimes talking from a business or an industry that's so similar to your own, it can
mm,
feel a little threatening that you're sort of thinking, well, why aren't you doing it like that?
mm,
But if you can simply point out the things that work really, really well in the aviation industry to create
mm,
a safe, a better working environment, a better culture, well, guess
mm,
what? They're the same things that work
mm,
within business to create
mm.
profitability and also, of course, a more just and better culture.
So tell me a little bit now about leadership and safety. I think that's very important. And I think especially the way things have evolved now after COVID, safety, decision making, maybe belonging, all of that is kind of has taken a different shape. Yeah. So what are
Yeah.
the challenges that you're noticing, by the way?
So I think when we see people doing a lot of remote working, I think one of the big issues that we're seeing there is that it has worked. And people are
Mm,
saying, but it's worked. So now why are we demanding that people are going back to a 5 days in the office scenario?
mm,
One thing that they had seen was the camaraderie around the workplace. And when you look at high performing teams, the thread that always connects them is going to be trust. And it's quite
mm,
hard to sometimes build up trust when we're only ever working remotely.
mm,
Whereas actually being in that office, especially for that generation that are joining the workplace,
mm,
those water cooler conversations that we would say,
mm,
you don't necessarily want to take to Teams or to Zoom or to whatever other platform you use
mm,
to ask a simple question. It
mm,
feels too formal to do that. And so you just don't
mm,
ask it. And so
mm,
that osmosis that we have from working in the office environment really helps.
mm,
But one of the areas that I think where I talk a lot around is that need for debriefing, facilitation, about coaching as well in the workplace. And
mm,
again, it's harder to do that when we're not working with someone day to day and actually seeing them because you don't
mm,
see how they're making their decisions. You're often seeing only the outcome of their decisions.
mm,
And so one of the things we focus a lot on is perhaps that intimacy of relationships, but also setting the tone at the top. So
mm,
how do you as a leader, for example, demonstrate really strong
mm,
leadership?
mm,
These days, the words that I am hearing all the time are authenticity,
mm,
vulnerability. Hold on a minute. These are not words that we were hearing associated with leadership 10, 15 years ago. We
right.
wanted Peter, a much more autocratic style of leadership. Whereas actually
Mm,
now we're seeing much more, that follower
mm,
style really coming in, that sort of subservient, the servant leadership style,
mm,
whereby if we as a leader surround ourselves with people who are more intelligent, who can make better decisions than us, well, then
mm,
why wouldn't? Because
mm,
now you've got a pool to pull from all of those people surrounding you, and you as a team can actually perform better.
mm,
So setting that tone at the top about vulnerability and talking openly about perhaps mistakes that you've made
mm,
opens up the dialogue for other people to talk more openly about their mistakes. Actually, by doing that, it's amazing what starts to come out, because if we link that into safety, Harris,
mm,
for any
mm,
one sort of big major event that happens, perhaps in aviation, that can be loss of life. You'll have 30 minor events where you will hear about them, but beneath this surface of the waterline, you'll have about 300 near misses. And if we don't talk about these near misses, they're the ones where we
mm.
got away with it, where
Right.
we, thank goodness I didn't send that email to the wrong person.
Mm,
Thank goodness I didn't make that, that call. Or all of these small slips or lapses that we make, we don't comment about them because
right.
we think, what's the point?
Mm,
Sometimes that can be about learned helplessness. Well, what's the point in telling people the system won't change? Or it
mm,
could be that we don't deem it to be important enough, or perhaps
mm,
we feel embarrassed. But now, if that tone is set by the
mm,
leader that said, I'm going to start the meeting today by just telling you about a mistake I made, then guess
mm.
what? You're now gonna hear about other mistakes, and you might get a better process out of that that will prevent
Right.
these
Yeah.
things that are happening at the bottom level.
Yeah. And it's also about culture of being open, just simple open
Yeah,
and being authentic. Yeah. And I think in my head, I'm also connecting your work as a pilot and decision making. I think decisions in that job are very precise. You
yeah,
can't have a maybe kind of a decision. Yeah. Because you can cost lives and could be fatal. So what did
yeah.
you learn about decision making as a leader there that I think leaders can apply?
So, I'm gonna share an example actually of a story. I
Mm,
was involved in a conflict in the Middle East,
mhm,
was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and it was in the run up to the Second Gulf War. And we
mhm,
were defending a no-fly zone, and I was engaged by a surface-to-air missile whilst we were flying. And basically, I was leading my first ever mission that night. And so I was a really junior pilot. But the way that we try to work within the military is you empower your junior people to lead by getting them to step up all the time,
mm,
because if you're doing that, you are creating a through flow of leaders for the future. So it's not this top down approach that we so often think, command and control, that we would envisage with the military. It's a very empowered learning environment. So I
mm,
was a junior pilot. I was leading a mission. I was engaged by a surface to air missile, which we managed to avoid and evade it by putting out countermeasures. But suddenly our entire mission changed. Now, that would have been easy for myself at this point to go into full panic mode. But
mm,
what happens is that we are taught in the form of competencies these days. So we're trained in not just scenario after scenario, which we do initially do that, but we recognize that we're flying in really complex environments at the moment. The
mm,
aircraft, like the commercial aircraft or the modern aircraft, you can't train for every eventuality. So we
mm,
do plan and we do train, but we also do competencies. And those competencies cover everything from how do we make decisions well? How
mm,
do mitigate threats? How do we
mm,
communicate? What's our decision making process like? Now,
mm,
one of the models that we're taught is something called D.O.D.A. And the first thing that we do is, well, quite a lot of the airlines have now put a T on the start. How much time do we have to make this decision? Now,
mhm.
in aviation, it's critical. And I'm hoping for
Yeah.
businesses a little bit longer time to make your decisions than three
Mm,
minutes. But in this scenario that I've just painted out, I had 3 minutes to make my decision. Now, as the leader, the really important thing is that when we take the first D, it's diagnose the problem. Traditionally, as a leader, you might say to your team, this is the problem. Now, if you
mm,
turn that on its head and you ask your team what the problem is and say, what problem do you see us having? If
mm,
you've got cognitive diversity within that team around you,
mm.
you might find out you had a different problem to the one that you thought you had in the first place. So put the
Yeah.
problem out team and find out what the actual problem is. Now we're sort of
Mm,
getting that root cause right at the start. Now we've got the starting point. You ask your team for options. Big
mm,
point here. You as the leader, you do not tell your team what the problem is. You do not tell your team what the options are that you would do. You ask your team. Because again,
mm.
if the lead, this is what I think we should do. Hierarchy will dictate that people will tend to go, yes, I think that's a great
Yeah.
idea if they
Mm,
disagree. And so now, really good point, if it's working on a table or boardroom level, get your team to write down 3 things that they would do. Now, because written those down and you would then go around the room, you don't just flow around the room. You would ask your team and say, can you give me your top one? Anyone else got that one down? Because now you're much more likely to get all of the 3 options that they've written down, as opposed to people just going, he said what I was going to say. You know, it's so easy to not actually think about it. But if you truly think about what options you want to come up with and write them down, you're now going to get a really varied conversation. Now, in the air, I asked my team to come up with options. And when those options come back to me, I very quickly pressure tested them with what we call BRAN: benefit of it, risk, alternative, or do nothing. So benefit, risk, alternative, do nothing. I run through those, and then I, as the leader, make the decision. So this is not collaborative decision making. This is option generation for the leader to still be accountable. And that word accountable, I think, is something that people shy away from a bit these days when we talk about leadership. Something that they don't really like to do. They want it all to be very collaborative. But actually being accountable in our decisions is part of being a leader. So you, the you make the decision, you assign the tasks to whoever is in your team, and then you review it. And that review at the end, that D.O.D.A, the R is really important, because if that whole decision-making process has taken a long time, weeks, potentially, maybe months, when you get to the reviews, how easy is it to think, we've spent so much time on this? It's called that sunk fallacy, where you put so much time and effort into doing something that actually you just think, let's do it anyway. But pressure test it right at the end, or say to yourself, give me a reason not to carry on. If you get a reason not to carry on, then ultimately you might find out that you're going down the wrong route, even if it's at the very end. And so we've been taught this decision-making model. And by having that to hang our hats on, it gives you a framework. And what you'll find as well, if people use something like that in the back of their minds, it stops people from procrastinating. And it also ensures people know where everybody else is on their decision-making process. And so having structure around it does really, really help.
Right, right. And I think what's very important here, what we notice is that time is very important to consider. A lot of time we just think of the decision and never make a decision, never get to conclusions because we don't consider time. And that has happened in a lot of work that we do with organizations, delays and delays just because we know what's the problem, we know what could be a solution, but we don't time it.
Yeah.
By when do we need to get there?
Yeah, I mean, putting that on it as well. And also the other thing is that so often we wait for everything to be absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
Let's just be really honest. You might never hit perfection. And so if you do, we would often say act on 80. Because if you're thinking in that way, I've got the majority of my knowledge, but I've got all the knowledge that I have at this moment to make the best decision I can with the resources I have and the information I have. I'm going to make a decision now. If in 2 months' time, I get more information, well, then I can change my decision and we can actually tweak it to fit in. But we're making the right decision that we have at that time. And again, a really good example of that was we were flying back out across the Atlantic. On the way back from that big exercise in America, we heard that America had shut their airspace. And of course, the date was incredibly sadly 9/11. But we were in the middle of the Atlantic doing air-to-air refueling with a tanker in thick cloud. And we heard every aircraft being turned back. We had no knowledge of what's gone on, but we've got to make decisions based on the facts that we had. Airspace is shut. There's chaos on the airwaves. What is my priority? And we would use the principle of controlling the controllables. And if you can't, let it go. So when you think about your own stress bucket, and we all have let's have an imaginary bucket of stress, and that bucket filling up constantly with superfluous things. It could be macro events, world economics, things that are going on in the workplace that are nothing to do with you, but they're sapping your capacity. So if you go back to your basics, almost say, what is within my immediate sphere of influence that I can have an impact on? And we make that on one priority. It gives us the capacity to cope. And we always go through the principles of fly your aeroplane, aviate, fly, navigate, communicate. Aviate, got to look after number one. I've got to make the right decisions for me and my team. I've got to work out where are we going and who do we need to talk to. And as we were from America with no information, we realized back to basics. Let's just scan the airspace in front of us to clear our passageway. But what was fascinating, as we came over the UK, we heard an awful radio call on the emergency channel. And it was an American ship. It was on a big exercise. It's an aircraft carrier. And there's a big 5-mile exclusion zone around the ship. but a small
Mm,
civilian airplane was flying directly towards it. It was
mm,
unaware of the danger it was in. The Americans believed that it was a terrorist. And so what we heard on the radio was they were loading live weapons and they were about to shoot this aircraft down. We had no knowledge of what's happened in America. We have no reason or understanding, but it's about recognizing that we potentially could do something about it. That whole feeling of breaking out of your silo to help
mm,
somebody else. And we contacted air traffic control and we said, this is where we are. We're hearing what's going on. Do you need help? Now, we'd been airborne for about 7 hours by now, and we were pretty tired at the end of an exhausting 3 weeks. But it's still about doing the right thing at the right time on the information that we have available. And in the end, air traffic control gave us radar vectors, and we
mm,
dived down from height. We managed to get the small civilian aeroplane to change his course, and he had about 3 minutes to run. So he would have been shot down over the UK that day, and that sort of
mm.
changed, not only my future but the way I looked at decision making. That act on
Right,
80. Making a decision is better than no decision.
right. You move forward at least. You do something about it, and then you just don't live in your head and keep thinking about it, and you start to get some result.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Always about
Mm,
moving forward, Harris. That's the most
yeah,
important thing.
yeah, yeah. Mandy, so you've written a book as well, and you're writing a book, and it's getting launched soon. Let's talk about the book now. I'm curious to
Yeah.
hear about. Okay.
So every time I was doing a speech, so I've been on this circuit doing motivational keynote speaking now for 13 years. And I was
Mm,
always asked, have you written a book? Oh my
mm,
goodness, this story would make a phenomenal movie. Let's write this
mm,
book. I used to say, oh no, I can't write, because I was much more involved in science, technology, and the engineering and math side of things, that STEM side.
mm,
And English was never my strength. And so I used to say, no, I can't write. And
mm,
then I say not yet. And eventually, 5 years ago, I finally found a way forward and I launched my book, An Officer, Not a
mm,
Gentleman.
mm,
And it was my autobiography. It was basically just pretty much talking about through my life, about my experiences on the front line of flying, and sort of taking it through to almost leaving the Air Force.
mm,
And I put it out to publishing houses, and initially it was rejected from them all. But my best rejection email came from a very big publishing house that said plain books are for a male readership that had no interest in a woman's story, which I thought was particularly open to a 21st century audience. Well, so far it's done brilliantly. It was on Amazon. I self-published it on Amazon, and it became the #1 best-selling book in aviation for pretty much on and off over 18 months. It's
yeah.
sold 50,000 copies globally now. And the second question I was then asked was, well, when's #2 coming out?
Yeah.
Now, I talked a lot about this with my husband. He's my fantastic wingman, been a partner together for 30 years, naval aviator, airline pilot, captain, trainer, examiner. He gives people their licenses. He awarded 2 Indian young women their licenses yesterday, as it happened, in the simulator to fly the Airbus A320. And so I have heard his stories over the year, but he's not a public speaker. And
Mm,
yet his stories are phenomenal in the
mm,
learning that you could take from it. And he's also severely dyslexic. And so we looked at this and we thought, hold on a minute. We've had an officer, not a gentleman. What about
mm,
having an officer and her gentleman? And so we decided to write this book collaboratively.
mm,
And so what it is it's 2 aviators, 2 cockpits, but 1 journey, because we're
mm,
looking at the lens through a story arc of a flight, and I'm so excited about it. It's launching, any day now, and basically, we're getting all the switches ready, the motivation switches, the mindset. So I talk about imposter syndrome, fear of failure, and I'll talk about it through my perspective, and then my husband Craig looks at it from his perspective, which is really different. We've always looked at things in a very different way. I'm extrovert, he's introvert, he's cognitively diverse. I found school and academia fairly simple. And so he's a planner. I'm much more off the cuff, like to do things at the last minute. And so we've got these real differences between us, but we've created this incredibly strong relationship and this feeling
mm,
of one journey. And
mm,
the book celebrates that journey, but it
mm,
also gives very different perspectives on all the subjects that we've talked about. From, there's a chapter called Your Captain Speaking, and it's all
mhm,
around leadership, my view on leadership and Craig's view on leadership. And
mm.
basically that metaphorical journey is part memoir, part, let's say, manifesto for life, really. So no, it's been a really exciting project to be involved in. And I can't wait to hear what people think about it as well. So yeah, An Officer and Her Gentleman.
Yeah, and I think it's another bestseller coming soon.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean,
Yeah.
My first one at one point was beating not only Obama in the charts, but some other incredible biographies as well. So yeah,
Mm.
it's an absolute honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to share my story.
Yeah. And will that be available on Amazon, or how are you
Yeah,
publishing it?
absolutely. Yeah, so it's going to be available on Amazon. I'm also hopefully going to be able to get that into bookstores this year as
Mhm.
well. But definitely on Amazon Kindle. I'm recording the audio book for it as well, so that will be available on Amazon.
Mm.
And also we have signed copies as well that come through my own website as well. So if people want personalized copies, then that tends to be more UK based, but it's probably easier to do and buy via Amazon actually for a more
Yeah.
global audience.
Mandy, what a pleasure speaking to you today, and really full of learning. This conversation has been for me. If people would like to get in touch with you to learn more about your journey and have a conversation with you, what's the best way to connect with you?
Probably just directly through my website, Harris. So it's as easy as it comes. It's mandyhickson.com. So www.mandyhickson.com.
Okay.
And I'd love to hear from anybody. As I said, I do travel all over the world. And yeah, I went as far afield as New Zealand this year. So
Mm.
I was speaking to audiences and corporate and military audiences in New Zealand. So no place is too far to travel to. And I do
Mm.
have that lovely sense of adventure, which takes me to lots of different places to meet different audiences and, be able to tailor
Mhm.
my sessions accordingly.
I'm sure we should be seeing you soon in Dubai.
I hope so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. We popped into Dubai actually. We were in Nepal. We did an expedition to the base camp of Everest
Okay.
a couple of years, and we went to Dubai on the way home actually, but it
Okay.
was only short-lived, so I do need to actually experience Dubai properly. So no, it would be lovely to come over to Dubai at some point soon, Paris.
Definitely, and be our guest.
Yeah, that would be
Um,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you for your time today, and looking forward to catching up with you soon, maybe in the UK or in Dubai.
Sounds absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for getting in touch and for inviting me to be part of your fantastic podcast. Thank you,
Thank you.
Harris.
Thank you.